Good evening. My name is Karen McAdams, and I am the Friends of Art coordinator at the Davis. I welcome you to a Davis Friends of Art virtual event, Everyday Photography. I would like to start by sharing an acknowledgement. The Davis Museum at Wellesley College is located on the ancestral and unceded tribal lands of the Massachusetts people. We acknowledge the continuing presence of the Massachusetts and their relatives and neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc people, and pay respect to Indigenous elders past and present. Before we begin, I would like to share a little bit about how to participate in today's program. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days. We are using a webinar format, and your microphone and video have been turned off during the presentation. Throughout the event, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions and upvote other questions. And at the end, we'll leave approximately 20 minutes for the Q&A session.
Today, I'm going to
So tonight, I'm so pleased to introduce Carrie Cushman, Linda Wyatt Gruber, 66, Curatorial Fellow in Photography, and Lisa Fischman, Ruth Gordon Shapiro, 37, Director. We'll begin the program by sharing a video produced by Carrie, which highlights 2 exhibitions she curated that opened at the Davis in February: Going Viral, Photography, Performance, and the Everyday, and Making Not Taking, Portrait Photography in the 19th Century. After the video, Carrie and Lisa will join us for a conversation about the 2 exhibitions, and then we'll finish the evening with the Q&A session. Enjoy.
Today, I'm going to share with you 2 exhibitions that I curated, which opened in February. I'll share my screen now. Both have to do with vernacular photography, which is to say everyday photography. The first, somewhat ominously titled Going Viral, Photography, Performance, and the Everyday, highlights the recent gift of nearly 1,000 anonymous snapshot photographs from the collection of Peter J. Cohen. Stewarding this group of photographs has been one of my main priorities since I started at the Davis in the fall of 2018. These aren't your typical museum objects. They are anonymous, private, ephemeral documents that have been taken out of their original context, and more often than not, those contexts, who created them, how they were shared and activated by their original owners, these things are impossible to resurrect. So along with the question of display and didactics, I had to grapple with how to organize an exhibition of material that covers a vast array of subject matter. Now, it's my contention that the pictures we all take every day are not as random as they may seem. There are reasons we take the pictures we take. Our social worlds inform why we see the way we see and why we value what we value. And those commonalities come through in all of our snapshots. So for this exhibition, I decided to focus on the patterns, performances, and rituals that we see repeated over and over in snapshot photographs, hence the title Going Viral. And this is how we get the context back. Because when you have one photograph of figures with their fists raised at each other performing the classic pugilist pose, there's not much you can say about the conditions surrounding the original creation of the particular image. But when you have dozens of examples depicting the same phenomenon, there's a story to tell. The exhibition begins with the story of Kodak and the rise of amateur photography. And in this vitrine, you can see an original Kodak camera along with some early photo manuals and a scrapbook with Kodak 1s and 2s. The show then proceeds to 11 different groupings based on some of the viral themes that I was able to identify in our collection of snapshots. The first viewing vistas, monuments men and showing skirts, fake fighting and cross-dressing, snapping shadows, pyromania, me, the ends, costumes and caricatures, and finally, pictures of people taking pictures. Before we move on to the next exhibit, I'd like to walk you through some of the curatorial decisions and interactive components of going viral. First, the framing. I felt very strongly that we not frame these objects as we might other works of art at the Davis. I wanted to signal their everydayness and try to reproduce the original format in which they may have been kept or viewed. So we chose to frame them in groups with black mats to echo the black pages of early scrapbooks, which are on view in a case in the middle of the gallery. And Mark, our preparator, even so patiently secured each photo in place with those scalloped scrapbook edges. Next, I wanted to give visitors something to hold because snapshots are objects that should be held. So instead of putting up traditional wall text, we printed all of the didactics as postcards with a snapshot on one side and the text on the back that visitors could hold and read and then take home with them. This had the added benefit of putting some of the images back out into the world. Finally, we created a make-your-own snapshot station, which included 3 Kodak cameras called Printomatics, which basically function like a Polaroid by automatically printing the photograph. The photos also have sticky backs, so we encouraged visitors to make 2 photographs based on their favorite theme in the exhibit, one to take with them and one to leave behind with comments in a scrapbook for the Davis. And I have to say, I can't believe how popular this was. Our student visitor assistants did an incredible job of helping people take pictures of themselves and their families. Within 2 weeks of the exhibition being opening, the scrapbook was full and I had to order more pages for it. So I was really pleased with how this turned out. Besides the scrapbook, the exhibition will live on in 2 main ways. The first is the catalog, creatively designed by the team at Stoltz. It includes an introductory essay, an interview with the collector, Peter Cohen, and longer, more historically rich introductions to each of the thematic sections. Since the museum has been closed, I've also added the show to our virtual platform with an amended introduction that I wrote in March, addressing the phrase going viral in the time of an actual pandemic. So I encourage you to check that out on the Davis website. The Cohen gift became one of my main points of entry for getting to know the Davis photo collection. And one area that immediately stood out to me was our collection of 19th century portraiture, which, like the snapshot, though of an earlier era, is one of the main ways that everyday people engage with the medium of photography. And this is how the exhibition, Making Not Taking, Portrait Photography in the 19th Century came about. The exhibition tells an earlier history of vernacular photography by exploring the space, experience, and products of the 19th century portrait studio, where a great deal of time, labor, materials, and strategy went into the making of a photograph. I should point out that approximately half of the photographs on display in Making Not Taking were gifts of FOA's very own Rosamund Bali, so thank you, Rosamund. The first section, 19th century materials, introduces the many different photographic formats that were available by the 1860s. Daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, carte de visite, and cabinet cards. The didactics explore how chemistry, in combination with materials like copper, glass, tin, and paper, created specific aesthetic and haptic effects that have informed how individuals viewed, handled, and spoke about their photographs. The second section, A Visit to the Portrait Studio, walks visitors through all of the decisions that went into making a portrait, from which props and backdrops to use, to the addition of hand-painted color on the surface of the photograph, or which type of case to house the portrait in. Without a doubt, the highlight of this section, and perhaps the entire exhibition, is the life-size recreation of the space where one would have their portrait made, what was known as the operating room. All of the objects that you see on display here, including the daguerreotype camera and the charcoal backdrop, are original 19th century antiques that were actually used in Boston-based portrait studios. The final section, Studios Around the Globe, explores how the theatrical elements of portrait studios were used to create generalized, often exoticized portraits of people from around the world, what became known as native types, based on false notions of race and class. I'm currently working on creating a virtual version of Making Not Taking that will be up on the Davis's Google Arts and Culture site in June. You may have noticed in some of the installation shots that a number of screens appear throughout the exhibition, and that's additional content that I developed with my summer intern, Stephanie Fan. And these are already available on the Davis app. So I encourage you to engage with the exhibition further this way. Before closing, I did want to share something very special that happened on the last day that the Davis was open to the campus before students were sent home. Professor William Van Beckham, who teaches studio photography in the art department, decided to bring his students to the Davis for the last day of in-person classes, where we made portraits in the studio that was created for Making Not Taking. We ended up spending the entire day there. The students photographed each other, the Davis staff, and the Davis seniors and student workers who came by in the afternoon for a farewell reception organized by Arthurina. Not only did the students learn about early portraiture, they even mimicked the longer exposure times and posed people using the head or neck clamp. But it really felt very special to create something tangible together before we all were sent away to continue on in this virtual capacity. So I'll leave you with a few portraits from that day. Here's Arthurina and Heather, a student from Arts 108, and Will, their professor. Two of our senior student workers at the Davis. On the left, the first year guides, and on the right, two of our interns from last summer, senior Megan McNally and my intern, Stephanie Fan. Thank you all for joining me for this brief tour. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to joining you all for questions and conversations later on. Thank you.
Hi, Lisa.
Well, thanks so much, Karen. Thanks to our Friends of Art who are so generous in supporting everything we do at the Davis. Really, we are endlessly grateful to you and glad to have you all here tonight. It's a huge pleasure to be able to do this with Carrie. And Carrie, thank you so much. I think that was the first recorded piece that was done at the Davis. You were the guinea pig. You did the first one.
It's amazing to think how many videos we have made since then.
We have. It's an entire library at this point. But let's take a step back from that time to the beginning of your work on going viral. Can you tell us a little bit about Peter Cohen and about his collection?
Sure. So Peter is an incredibly generous person. He lives in New York City and began collecting fine art photography in the 1970s. And then in the early 90s, he was at a thrift store and stumbled upon, you go to fairs and things and see these boxes of just other people's photographs for sale. And he really liked them. And so he bought a few. And the next week he went back and he bought a few more. And it really grew quite quickly from there to now a collection of over, I think, 60,000 anonymous snapshot photographs, old snapshot albums, album pages, all kinds of vernacular photographs that he has organized into about 130 different categories based on patterns that he started to pick up on through his collecting. And just in the past couple of years, he has begun to gift his collection to different museums. They now reside in about, I think, almost 40 different collections throughout the country, of which we are one of the lucky recipients.
I felt very lucky to visit him at home in New York that first time. I think surrounded by orange archival shoeboxes, basically, with these odd labels, very provocative and intriguing. And then the open opportunity to just sit and go through them. I've never had a chance like that to do something.
It's really a time warp. Like, you enter his apartment, and I think I went there for the first time with you, maybe my first month working at the Davis in the fall of 2018. And yeah, you just sit down on his couch and you start going through these boxes and boxes and boxes, and then 6 hours have passed.
Absolutely. But also Peter wants to talk about every single one and about how he understands them, right? How he understands them in terms of types. And I think that I have known a lot of obsessive collectors, but he is really up there.
Yeah. To our benefit.
To our benefit, to our massive benefit. He's just a gem. Well, it strikes me, given the abundance, I kind of joke that those shoeboxes really have become like an architectural element in his apartment. They're load bearing at this point. But the snapshots that he collects are so common as to be both banal and fascinating. How do they manage that? I mean, that's really the question that one comes away with. What do they say about our individual and collective investments in photography as a medium, as a vehicle for reality and for memory?
Yeah, well, I mean, that experience that you and I are both have had there really encapsulates those dual properties of banality and fascination. And I think it comes together in their relatability. When I was sitting on his couch for the first time, I think I was going through a box called Human Pyramid, which is, of course, people climbing on each other to create a pyramid. And it's so mundane, but I was like, oh, I've done this. And I kind of just kept expecting to find a photograph of myself somewhere in his collection. So they're all immediately relatable that way. And I know that many people had that experience in just the short month that the exhibit was open too. Opening night, so many people came up to me and said, oh, I have a photograph just like that of my parents or myself or what have you. So I think the relatability is really important. Something else that I became very interested in the research for this exhibition was looking at, the very early days of snapshot photography and how Kodak ads and user manuals really taught us or taught people to apprehend their experiences as objects of nostalgia when they were happening, which I think speaks to your question about this relationship between reality and memory. Before, you may have visited the Grand Canyon with your family without a camera, and it was a memorable experience. But after the year 1900, people are visiting the Grand Canyon with a camera and know I'm going to feel a bit nostalgic about this later. So I need to make a memory of it now. So you're really aware of that memory making as it's happening when you gather your family together to snap the shutter. So yeah, I think that we're highly aware of this kind of memory making as it's happening. And then after it happens, at least when people used to print out their photographs, people still do this with their phones. You use those photographs to speak and to talk about your experiences and to process them. It's kind of that classic of example of like you run into someone with their grandchild and say, "Oh, your granddaughter's so cute." And then they pull out their wallet and say, "Yeah, but look at the picture of her." She's right there, but they're showing you a picture of her. It just encapsulates the way that we use our photographs to process our lives, our experiences, to really locate uh, the things that are important to us, our values.
Absolutely. And I have to say that came through so beautifully in the exhibition. It was really, really powerful because of the ways that, multiple examples in each category, right, reflected, I mean, the compulsion, let's say, of these, unknown photo enthusiasts to take shots in these categories that clearly were ubiquitous. And then, they're totally familiar. The images are totally familiar. But your work, both as a scholar in writing about these objects, but also in terms of the way that you designed the exhibition, made them fresh and compelling and new. So I want you to speak about that a little bit.
Oh, well, thank you for that. I'm glad that they were able to do that. Um, yeah, so I think it's funny, there are certain events and rituals that we all have in our lives that it's very understandable why we take pictures of them, like weddings, graduations, people's birthdays. The more you spend time with these types of objects, though, things that originally seemed spontaneous start to appear really weird when you see them repeated over and over and over again. It's almost like when you say the same word over and over,
Right.
it becomes completely defamiliarized.
Right.
And I really got hung up on this. One category in particular where I had this experience was the one called showing skirts, which of course is just pictures of women or little girls holding out their skirts for the camera. And you see one of these and, I at least have vivid memories of doing that as a
I do too.
child.
Yeah.
But then Peter has thousands of examples of this, and you realize why? Why is everyone holding their skirt out for a camera? It's really weird.
It is weird.
And so I realized there has to be a reason. There has to be a social, historical convention for this. And all it takes is, some historical work and some digging to learn that skirts, lightweight, short skirts that you could do that gesture with, came of age at the same time as snapshot photography. So at the time when everyone had their own camera. So we're talking about like the 19 teens and the 1920s. And so both together were modes of expression for modern women. And this becomes apparent I found examples where, you couldn't tell if you were looking at an ad for Kodak or an ad in Vogue magazine because they were the exact same image. And so you realize, how these values of, we might say, like feminine charm, become embedded in that simple gesture, and then also the gesture of documenting it with a camera.
It doesn't really account how you and I both have done that, have made that gesture.
I know.
But, I don't know why that lingered because we were not doing that in 1900.
Yeah, I know.
The pictures in Making Not Taking, although much older, were also very familiar in their time. Can you explain the title of the exhibition to get at how you theorize photographic activity during the early years of the medium?
Sure. So as I said, the Cohen collection for me was really how I got to know the Davis collection. So from the beginning, I was looking for other examples of vernacular photography. And I don't know that 19th century portraiture would traditionally be described that way as everyday photography, but for me, it is. It was the main way that your average person engaged with photography in the 19th century. And, but I recognize that it was also very different from the snapping that
Right.
was
Sure.
happening after Kodak. So I wanted to emphasize that with the title and the exhibition itself by focusing on this idea of making. And
Mhm.
we did that in two main ways. So, making first in terms of, as you saw in that recreation of the operating room, all of the materials, the equipment, the time, the labor, the process, the chemicals, everything that went into just making one of these photographs. I think Warren's calling it making and not taking.
Uh-huh.
Um, but also, what connects it to the Going Viral show is making in terms of social constructions. So there was an understanding of what would make a good portrait in the
Mhm.
19th century. And that was up to the sitters themselves. I want to appear like a, proper middle class woman. So there are certain things I'm going to wear for my portrait. There are certain things I'm going to hold, a
Mhm.
book so that people know I'm literate. I'm going to choose this backdrop that makes me look very wealthy. Things like this also went into the making of an image at the time.
So those conventions are really interesting, and they remind me a lot of conventions that people would have been familiar with from painting, from from painted portraits, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that
Certainly.
become much more agile and available through photography to many other kinds of people, which is,
Yeah.
you
I
know,
mean, within just a few years of the daguerreotype being invented, pretty much anyone could afford to have their portrait made, which is incredible.
it
To
is
go
incredible.
from having to commission someone to paint you, um, to being able to walk into a studio and have your portrait made yourself.
And I think, in fact, much more magically so,
Mm.
right? I mean, there's like chemistry and magic that happens that suddenly you're reproduced on a sheet of paper, basically,
Yeah.
or a glass slide, or whatever your base is. Um, you talk about framing in the cases of both exhibitions. So in Going Viral, you were speaking about working with our preparator, Mark Beeman, to mount and frame snapshots to signal their everydayness. And you did that with corners and sort of evoking the scrapbook. You also worked hard to recreate the portraiture studio and making, not taking. So the issue of authenticity is representing the experience of the original context for these objects is important in both cases. It becomes a matter of design. We've talked about that a little bit already, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about how the two were distinguished and how much that work revealed for you.
Yeah. In all my curating, I think it's really important to try and get at the objecthood of works of art as much as possible, but it seemed even more important here, so that we were distinguishing, the pictures we all take here that are really more register more as images,
Mm-hmm.
to distinguish that from these photographs as objects, that lived in people's pockets, in their frames, in their drawers, in their homes, that were touched and handled all the time. As I said, used to speak with, used to storytell with. So, one of the really guiding questions for both in terms of exhibition design was how to get at that embodied experience of a photograph within the space of the museum. And I think that design can do a great job at this, like without people touching stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
We didn't let people enter that space of the recreated studio,
right.
but just standing next to it, standing next to the physical objects, you can imagine entering the space. You see, what that head clamp is made of. And you can imagine how unpleasant it would be holding your neck for, I don't know, 5, 10 seconds. Um, so yeah, that all became really important for me and would not have been possible without very generous donations and, of course, Mark's patience and creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so what happens when objects that you might find in a scrapbook or an attic or a shoebox or thrift store bins end up in museum galleries? What arguments animate the scholarship? I know that you've been to a lot of conferences. There are a lot of scholars thinking about these issues around anonymous snapshots. So what are the conversations around both curating and collecting?
You're right. It's a huge topic right now. Aperture just published another giant book about these types of vernacular images and what do we do with them?
Mhm.
Because at least in the early years of major museums starting to exhibit things like anonymous snapshots, there was a lot of pushback. A lot of critics who felt like, just the mere act of selecting certain snapshots, or we could say the same thing for 19th century portraits, these really ubiquitous
Mhm.
type of uh, photographs. Um, the mere act of selecting them for a collection, let alone selecting them for an exhibition and then to be framed and put on a wall, is making them special and making them into something that they're not. Um, Making them into works of art,
Mhm.
basically. Um, and so there was a lot of pushback about this, and which makes it difficult, now as a curator, when I was trying to choose which photographs to include in both shows, I had to be attentive to, im- photos that really excited me, but
Mhm.
also ones I found boring. Because that's the true nature of a lot of this material is it's banal, it's mundane. And so you want to strike a balance of that. And of course, what's boring to me might not be boring to someone
Well, sure.
else. Um,
But were you looking for the artfulness? I mean, was artfulness a category of interest for you?
Not really. Well, in making that taking, yes, certainly. In thinking about the ways that sitters in combinations with the camera operators composed their portraits, I
Mhm.
think they were trying to make them artful. So there certainly, but not for going viral. I was much more interested in working from the themes that I had identified
Mhm.
and finding a diverse array of examples that represented that theme.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, so I really tried not to do that.
Mhm.
But because I had read so much about critiques of museums who had relied on those that type of framework in the past.
Right. Right.
Um, Instead, I think the other main problem that a lot of curators and historians are talking about today with this type of material is how to use it reliably when you don't have a lot of historical context.
Mm.
Um, like I showed with the examples of the fake fighting,
Mhm.
we can never take one anonymous photograph and find out everything about the moment that it was made like we would as good curators with other works of art in the museum.
Right.
So instead, you have to rely on a lot of other skills that we don't necessarily associate with this kind of a historical work. So
Mhm.
things like affect or resonance, or even just your imagination or a hunch
Mhm.
about why these photographs belong together. Um,
Well, and having seen many, many, many examples, right? You start to develop. I mean, that's your kind of keen eye, right? Your acute perception about types.
right. And just knowing there has to be a reason for all of this. Yeah.
I think, some of the categories were more difficult than others. And I wonder if we could talk about some of the difficult objects that you encountered in art collection and in Peter's. How did you incorporate and contend with the portrait studio's more nefarious uses in the 19th century, such as ethnographic photography?
Thank you for that. Yeah, so it was important to me that making not taking have a global perspective. That even though the majority of the portraits in our collection at the Davis come from the United States, that we recognize that this was a technology that was in use pretty simultaneously everywhere all over the world. It spread very rapidly. But as you said, not always for positive uses. And one of the examples that we had an entire section devoted to in making not taking is this notion of types photography. So these aren't portraits, but these are photographs usually made by Western photographers in other countries that depict, often they're called native types. So one example was a samurai from Japan. And there are many different reasons these types of photographs were made. Some to appeal to a growing tourist population in the country, some as a kind of document to document cultures that were perceived to be under threat. So another example of that in the exhibition were postcards of Native Americans made in the United States. Also, as you said, for ethnographic study. So I really tried to contextualize this through by bringing in the history of the kind of pseudosciences like phrenology that were driving these investigations and this type of image making at the time. But we were very lucky to also be able to address this history through programming. So we received a grant from the Burn Schwartz Family Foundation, which allowed us to bring in contemporary photographers who are dealing with these very problematic racist legacies today. They're using the exact same methods. Last week we heard from Myra Green, who uses ambrotypes, which was the main photographic medium that was used to document slaves in the 19th century. She's using them to rethink these racial categories today and how they stick with us in the images that we are all surrounded by and move through all the time.
That was a fantastic event. I mean, her talk was great, and Nikki Green's interlocutor role was really, really exciting. And I think she brought forward, both of them brought forward these issues around early photographic processes in relation to race and bodies and the construction of identity that were just incredibly interesting. What's next? What's next up?
Yes, next December 10th, we will have Will Wilson, who is a contemporary Native American photographer working in tintypes and addressing the legacy of people like William Curtis and these very romantic and stereotypical images in the 19th century that were created about Native Americans. He's addressing that by making tintypes of his own community today, and even applying new, breaking edge technology like VR to activate the tintypes so that people are actually speaking back at you from the image and telling you about themselves in a way that, the people in the 19th century had much less agency in that sense. So I'm really looking forward to that talk.
I think that the programming really has expanded on unpacking the questions that the exhibition sets up, which is really exciting. It's very clever. Very well done. And I'm really enjoying them. I mean, I'm learning something with everyone, so it's exciting for me too.
I'm glad.
With that, should we open to some questions? What do you think?
Sure.
Karen, can we do that?
Yes.
Hey.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Thank you so much. There are no questions right now, so I want to remind everybody to go ahead and type your questions into the question box. And I will read those out as soon as questions start to fill in. I will go ahead and start with one. Throughout the going viral, were there any themes around geography that you felt like came through? Like were there more coastal, more interior? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
That's a good question. I feel like there's really a mix because another, interesting. I talked about how skirts and cameras, handheld cameras came of age together. Cars were also in the mix. So the explosion of car ownership in the United States also coincides with people having their own cameras that you could take anywhere. And that was how people spent their weekends. Weekends were also new. Leisure time was new in the early
remember all of that.
century.
Yeah.
So, it was an activity to, get in your car, take your camera, a middle class activity, and travel out for the day snapping photographs. And Kodak even went so far as to erect signs along all of the new highways throughout the country that would alert people, this is a Kodak moment, stop here. So you knew to stop and take a photograph at some scenic site or monument or something. So I really feel like there's a huge range because of this increased flexibility in terms of where people could be and how they spent their time.
Yeah, great.
I was pretty convinced driving through, I was living in Arizona and I would drive around in the Southwest and I would drive through through Arizona into the bottom of New Mexico and then up and then over. And I think that those pull-off points on those highways are absolutely those Kodak Vista spots. And in some of them, I think you can still see signs that, suggest that, right? Because it's clear where you're expected to stop. And it's clearly about the view, right?
Our technology and media specialist at the Davis, Serena Conradi, actually has her own artistic project where she photographs these signs that have been put up at Disney World. So like in the that I don't know what it's called, but the one where you can go around to all the different countries. Epcot. They have reproduced those Kodak moment signs in Epcot. So, but they're supposed to look historical, and Serena has an art project about that.
That's great. Mm-hmm. Okay, we have some questions in. So the first question is from Emily Weddle, and she shares that she found your thought. I'm going to share her thought first, and then I'll read her question. But she said that she found that your thoughts on whether these anonymous photographs should be considered in exhibitions as they were intended, everyday items, or as art is traditionally treated, mounted on a wall. She says it's fascinating, and it sparked her question. At what point do we look back on a time period with nostalgia as a separate moment of time that should be treated differently than our everyday?
Oh, that is such a good question. Well, in the context of this exhibition, I think that, moments where our technology changes so drastically has a lot to do with that. I think people certainly, Peter included, myself included, feel very nostalgic about these analog snapshot photographs. More so because of our relationship to photography today, which takes place primarily through our phones. In a way that's, this is kind of what I wanted to get at with the title of Going Viral, was that this is a phrase we use today to talk about the way that we take pictures. It's obviously very different though. They're so much more ubiquitous. There's so in numbers, there's just so many more pictures today, and they're disposable in a way that they weren't. when you had a physical, when you were working with a film camera. And so I think all of that, the major shift in technology that happens in the late 90s, early 2000s makes us even more nostalgic about, and maybe the same could be true looking from going viral to making not taking, that when Kodak took over, people became more nostalgic about 19th century photographic formats.
Interesting.
The next question is from Julia Antonatos, and she says, thank you to both of you. Could you please talk about how you selected the photos from Peter Cohen's collection that were added to the Davis's collection? How did that process work, given that 40 other institutions were also looking at this collection as well?
That's a really good question. So like I said, there's about 60,000 in his collection, so plenty to go around. But every time I visited, there were people from other institutions there too.
Mhm.
And I actually had like a little, some competition with a curator at the MFA over this one album that I really wanted, and she ended up getting. But I should say that for the Davis's collection, this was a group effort. So it started years before I arrived, with Lisa and former Davis curators and professors from the art history department all visiting Peter over a period of, what, Lisa, 5 years?
Yeah, really.
So by the time I came around, there had already been a lot selected by people from Wellesley and set aside, and then I was the last to go and kind of go through that and then make my own selections as well, which I think is how we ended up with so many, about 1,000. But I'll just say that as Lisa said, the archival boxes are a part of the architecture of Peter's apartment, and his prior organization of the snapshots into these categories necessarily guides the way that you encounter them. Unless you go in, which I know some of us did, with pre-existing ideas of things we wanted to fill in the collection. So for example, there are lots of photographs in our collection of course, made by and of women, which seemed very appropriate for Wellesley College. In other ways, we were able to work on larger acquisition goals, like diversifying and working on the inclusivity of our collection by gathering a lot of photographs of Native American and African American families.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were goals set ahead of time, but also just your personal interests can't help but take hold, and guide you to when you look at a box called 1945, like, well, what's in there?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Rosamond Volley asks, can we access the past programs that, like the one that you were referencing?
Yes. Hello, Rosamond. Wonderful question. So all of the artist talks, this was originally supposed to be a symposium conveniently scheduled for the first week of March, that we reconceived into a series of virtual artist talks that will now be extended through the spring, actually. So we'll have 4 more beginning in February after Will's next month. And they are all up on YouTube. So we can share that information with FOA. I think it's been going out in the newsletters, and you can access them there.
Yeah, the register. So the links, the listings, and the links are all in the monthly newsletter. So the next question comes from an anonymous attendee. It says, thank you so much for the program. I'm wondering whether at the beginning of the snapshot days, were more photos taken by men or women? Was it considered a male activity or more emotional and therefore female?
That is such a good question. And definitely in the 19th century, photography, because of the chemicals, all the equipment, the labor, the muscle that went into it, was very, in the rhetoric around it, in who did it, very much a masculine activity. Interestingly, Kodak targeted its advertising to women and to everyone by using images of women handling cameras to show people how easy it was. It's so easy to do, even a woman can do it. So right away, it became an activity for everyone. You know, one of their first and major models that I'm sure many people will recognize the name of is the Brownie camera.
Mhm.
Brownie referring to, you know, those little mythical creatures that were in children's stories at the times. Again, appealing to children, just to show that really anyone could do this. Anyone can have a camera and use it. It doesn't require all of this technical expertise or labor that it did just a decade before. So quite immediately, it was used by pretty much everyone, which isn't to say that it wasn't still gendered in certain ways, but everyone was using cameras.
Great. Rosamond says, I have difficulty considering 19th century photographs as vernacular, particularly daguerreotypes and ambrotypes, because they were truly considered precious objects at the time, encased for their preservation and protection. And they were very carefully made. And she'd like to know your comments.
That's a really good point. I appreciate that pushback. I guess when I think of the word vernacular, I think of everyday. And um, indeed, they were precious. As you said, housed in, especially, I think by the time we get to tintypes, that changes a little bit because they're so much more durable. But as you said, kept in these really precious cases. They were almost treated like the family Bible, like a family heirloom in a way. Um, but that was a work of art that didn't exist in, you know, regular everyday families prior to the technology. Um, and I mean, having like your portrait made. So that was my thinking in calling them vernacular, but I take your point.
Well, they become, I mean, it becomes much more widespread and different to, for example, the class stratification that you would associate with having your portrait painted,
Mm.
and the kinds of documentation that would go into that process, right? Um, just something starts to shift. The lines there become more porous.
Mm.
We have one more question from Deborah Good, and she says, thank you. She said, did Peter Cohen develop all 130 categories himself, or what were the antecedents of this type of categorization?
So, as I understand it, for a number of years, he was just collecting as he liked. And with pressure from his family, who was living amongst all of these things, he was encouraged to organize it in some way. And at that point, he hired an assistant and a curator. And I never met his original curator. Did you, Lisa?
I think I did. Yeah, I
Okay.
think I did the first time.
I worked with her predecessor, and um, so her and Peter worked a lot together on organizing them according to categories that he identified, that he would see in the market. You know, I said he originally went to a lot of thrift stores for these kinds of objects. Now he purchases them mostly on eBay, and he buys according to these patterns that he identified himself. But apparently, when he did first start this process of organization, it wasn't that hard because he unwittingly had already been collecting according to things that he saw repeated. But interestingly, he did once tell me that after the period of organization and coming up with all these categories, he felt more compelled, like he had to fill them. So he has this one category called Three Graces that's always photographs of three women. The interesting part being you have to assume there's a fourth woman taking the photograph. But nevertheless, it's called Three Graces. And he said once I identified this as one of his categories. Anytime he saw a picture of three women, he had to have it, which goes back to Lisa's original point at the start of our conversation about his very unique eye and obsession with these types of objects.
But I think
that
for
is
example,
contagious.
Yeah, completely contagious. But I think he made that up, right? He made up the Three Graces.
Yeah.
He's not buying in pre-categorized
No.
ways.
A
So
lot of them are made up and bizarre, like people standing on the side of the road with a cactus.
yeah.
How is that a thing? And yet he has hundreds of examples of it. Others are much more obvious. One of my favorite categories are photographs that people took of their cameras, photographs that people took of their television screens during the moon landing, which is incredible because you can imagine, I mean, for someone like me who was not alive when that happened, I can still imagine the significance of that moment and wanting to document that you were there and you saw it. So you take a picture of your TV screen, which seems so silly, and yet there's so much power in that, especially when you see it
You
collected.
showed those at the museum, and it was so great to see those.
Yeah, on the anniversary we had them up.
Great. Well, that is our final question of the evening. So thank you both so very much. Fascinating conversation. Thank you to all of our Friends of Art members and colleagues who have joined us tonight. We are ever thankful for your continued support and hope that you will join us for our next, I'm going to share my screen. Our next event is coming up. And on January 13th, we'll be joined by Heather Hughes, Kemper Assistant Curator of Academic Affairs, and Amanda Gilvin, Senior Curator of Collections and Assistant Director, and they'll be talking about Davis digital tools.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Karen.
Have a great night.
Good night.
Thank you.